Good evening. Can you hear me? So my name is Stefan Boatwright. I am a representative of the Left Forum Board. It is my job to welcome you to Left Forum 2016. Thank you all for coming. We are sure that this is going to be a wonderful forum. I attended my first forum in 2010, just like many of you, as a spectator. It was a really amazing forum. I saw Dr. Cornel West almost blow the podium into the audience when he was so animated. I knew that it was something I wanted to be a part of from that very moment. So during 2011, when I started my doctorate, I joined up with the forum. Back then we were talking about Occupy Wall Street. 2016, we are talking about a democratic socialist gaining millions of votes throughout the country. Times are definitely changing. Last but not least, your host for the evening, a woman who needs practically no introduction. Ms. Laura Flanders is the executive producer and host of The Laura Flanders Show. She was the founder and host of Grit TV with Laura Flanders. Her books include Bushwomen, Tales of a Cynical Species, and Blue Grit, True Democrats Take Back Politics from the Politicians. And she's also available on podcasts. Please give a warm welcome to Ms. Laura Flanders.
We're here to take on one particular part of the conversation at the Left Forum this weekend, capitalism and militarism at humanity's peril. Now, I would say when we have a former Nobel Peace Prize winner, Barack Obama, awarding a Distinguished Public Service Award to Henry Kissinger, our humanity is more than at peril, and it tells you a thing or two about the Nobel Prize. But there's other news to discuss as well. We have the first Muslim mayor elected in London. We have 2.4 million people contributing to the Bernie Sanders campaign. A man who has not forsworn the use of drones. We have Donald Trump proving that, in case anyone wondered, white supremacy, white male patriarchal supremacy is alive and well and deadly. And we have an election on our hands while we try to build a movement that will move beyond this electoral morass. I don't need to tell you that capitalism today is characterized by massive and increasing inequality. In case you forgot, Oxfam earlier this year reported that 62 people own the same wealth as half of the world. That's 3.6 billion with a B people. And only 9 of those 62 are women. How are we now to understand the connections? And I think that's the challenge of this evening's plenary, is trying to understand the connections between, for example, extreme policing and mass incarceration and extreme pilfering and profiteering and resource extraction. Most importantly, we're going to talk about where the cracks are in this system, what peace movements, what peace and justice movements are developing and how they are tackling empire, what kinds of leverage, both in and beyond the military-industrial complex, do workers and others actually have to disrupt the onslaught of militarization, and where is this leverage being used to build alternatives?
So when I came in, I was handed a broadsheet that pulled a quote, a half of a quote that I made. And so since I want to talk about the nature of power during this electoral campaign, I will finish the quote. I did indeed say it is not our job to take power, but it didn't end there. It is our job to make the powerful frightened of us. That is what movements do. Movements keep power in check. And as any good anarchists will tell you, power is always the problem, no matter who holds it. This is a realization that Karl Popper made in The Open Society and Its Enemies, where he wrote that it is not the job to get good people to rule. That, Popper says, is the wrong question. How do we get good people to rule? Rather, it is to create a system where those in power are frightened of us. Yes, we certainly want to push forward into power those who will listen, but without those movements, without the power of movements to keep the powerful in check, all power becomes despotic. One of the mistakes that Bernie Sanders made, a mistake that Kshama Sawant and I called him out on before he announced his campaign, was the decision to run within the embrace of the Democratic Party. And we are now watching Bernie Sanders supporters, and I think arguably Sanders himself, confront the fact that this has been a rigged system. That when you have a system, let's not forget, by the way, that the cost of running the primaries is paid for by the taxpayer. And yet the primary rules are determined by the Democratic Party, so that they can manipulate a system as they did in Nevada to steal the vote from Sanders. They lock out independents. This is why in that last cycle, Sanders only won Rhode Island. That was the only state in which independents were allowed to vote. You have a system of superdelegates. You have money from super PACs. It's very clear that without all of these mechanisms, Sanders would win the nomination. And yet, through this long process, we have been given palpable evidence that democracy within the United States is a facade. And we are about to enter an electoral process with two presidential candidates who have the highest negativity ratings in American history, Donald Trump being number one and Hillary Clinton being number two. And those of us who care about recovering agency within our country, overthrowing the corporate coup d'etat that has taken place, and just for Homeland Security, who might be here tonight, let me repeat that word, that's called overthrow. We are going to have to step outside that system and build movements that resist. We are going to have to free ourselves from the insidious mantra of the least worst, because it doesn't work. Every election cycle, we're fed the mantra of the least worst, and it gets worse. Because our two-party duopoly, while it has a different rhetoric, serves the same centers of power. You can understand the awful dynamics of the corporate state by looking at what it does to the most vulnerable among us, and the best place to do that is in a prison where corporations have reached their deadly tentacles down to every facet of prison life. Global Tel-Link, which has taken over the phone services, and let's remember, the phone is the primary way that children remain in contact with their incarcerated parents, is 4 to 5 times higher than what we pay. Commissary has been privatized, and prices have ratcheted upwards. In New Jersey, you make $28 a month for 40 hours a week. It's neo-slavery. It's alive and well. Fees are now imposed on you in prison. For instance, if you have a bereavement visit to someone who's dying, or you visit a member of the immediate family who's dead, in 15 minutes you get. You pay for the guards, the overtime. It's $900. And when they get out of prison and thousands of dollars in debt, as ex-felons, they can't get jobs, 1, because there aren't any jobs, and 2, because they're demonized. And if they can't maintain those payments, they go right back into prison. And that's why that guy who got stopped for a taillight runs and is shot in the back. Some people say the system of mass incarceration doesn't work. No, they're wrong. It works just the way it's designed to work. It works because we have created, with the loss of our manufacturing base and the assault on our working class, a group of surplus labor who their brown and black bodies do not generate an income for corporations until they are locked in cages where they can generate $40,000 or $50,000 a year. The only mechanism left is to carry out nationwide work stoppages within those prisons, because no prison can operate unless you have prison labor. And that is an example for all of us. Let us understand that if we mobilize and stand up and begin to disrupt this system, we can take power back into our own hands and eventually build in the years ahead towards the destruction of the corporate state. Thank you.
First, I want to just summarize what has happened to the peace movement under Obama. Now, let's remember that Obama came to power because he beat Hillary Clinton, and he beat Hillary Clinton, why? The Iraq War. The Iraq War. He was perceived as a peace candidate, and that's how he became president. Now, let's give him a credit for a couple of good things, really good things that have happened in these last 7+ years. One is the Iran nuclear deal, incredibly important, done against great odds, with the help of a lot of people in this room, I'm sure, but going up against big lobby groups like AIPAC, going up against Israel, going up against a lot of powers that did not want to see this go through, and it won. And the other is Cuba. Let's recognize that Obama did an amazing job opening up to Cuba. There's still a lot to be done. The embargo still exists. But let's recognize these are two diplomatic successes that happened under his administration. But also, let's not forget, they did not happen while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. They happened after Hillary Clinton left and John Kerry came in and acted more like a diplomat. So those are two positive things that have happened. But there have been so many bad things that have happened on the foreign policy front. Let's remember that this peace president, as Laura Flanders said, who got the Nobel Peace Prize, did not get us out of the wars of Iraq or Afghanistan, has bombed 7 countries at least, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and Syria, has not closed Guantanamo as he promised. In fact, instead of closing Guantanamo, he would have been embarrassed to put more prisoners into Guantanamo, and his answer was instead to use drones to just kill people instead of capturing them and imprisoning them. And so he became the drone commander-in-chief that has spread this horrendous technology, not only being used in the United States, but is spreading it to many other countries around the world. He didn't close the over 800 military bases we have overseas. In fact, has been involved in building new bases. Let's remember what Martin Luther King said at the time of the Vietnam War stands true today. The U.S. is the largest purveyor of violence in the world. And it's not only the violence that the U.S. does directly, it's also the indirect violence, because our #1 industrial export right now is what? Weapons. And when your #1 export is weapons, your #1 global marketing strategy is endless war. So the U.S. sells weapons, lots and lots of weapons. And the #1 purchaser of U.S. weapons is? No, it's not Israel. Saudi Arabia, that's right. Now think of how absurd and how obscene this is. Saudi Arabia, a country that is #1 in beheadings in the world, a country that treats women as minors their entire lives, the only country in the world where women are not even allowed to drive, a country that exports extremism, Wahhabism, the distorted form of Islam that is exported around the world thanks to the petrodollars that the Saudis have. The Saudis, who got involved in the internal affairs of Yemen, dropping bombs since March of last year that have killed thousands of people, thousands of innocent people, have taken that poor country of Yemen to the extreme of a humanitarian crisis. With our weapons, including cluster bombs banned by the international community that makes us complicit in war crimes. The Saudis, our #1 purchaser of weapons. The #1 recipient of US military money is Israel. Another major human rights violator, an apartheid state that on a daily basis is oppressing the Palestinian people. That state is the #1 recipient of our tax dollars to the tune of $3 billion a year, but that's not enough for the Israeli government. In fact, to give their okay to the Iran nuclear deal, they said you must sweeten this by giving billions more to us. They wanted $5 billion. Obama said, let's go for $4 billion. We're at $4 billion, negotiations still going on, they want more. We have a tremendous opportunity to show that whether it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, they represent an economy that's built on competition. We want one that's built on cooperation. Instead of one that's built on constant growth that destroys the future, we want one built on sustainability. Instead of one built on us versus them, we want one that's built on interconnectiveness. Instead of one that judges success by wealth like Donald Trump, from casinos to luxury hotels to how many golf courses he's built, we want ones that are measured by healthy communities and healthy ecosystems. We want a vision that engages and inspires and unites people from the Black Lives Matter movement, the immigrant rights movement, the peace movement, the environmental movement, the labor rights, the artists, the students, to say that we will only give peace a chance when we challenge those in power and replace the war economy with a local peace economy. Thank you.
I think the model which Medea has outlined, local strength, building local grassroots, I would add to that, building political bases locally and on a statewide level before expending our energies on a national campaign. That's what the left is capable of doing. The Seattle example is a very good one. When an excellent campaign by a socialist, Kshama Sawant, has resulted in her winning at the elections again to the council, despite heavy democratic action against her and the Democrats trying to find a candidate of color, etc. They won. It's a good model. And one shouldn't sit back, one shouldn't sit back and do nothing and wait. And that is the encouraging thing. I have to be honest with you, when I read some opinion poll which said that 30% of those who've been supporting Bernie have said that they will not, under any circumstances, vote for Hillary Clinton. I think that's positive. We live in a very strange world, a world of transition in which the system that is in place is not working. Everyone knows it's not working. We know it's not working, and those who run the system know it's not working. Because were it working even a tiny bit, then all these jokers in Wall Street, the bankers who stole money, half of them would be in prison for what they did. That's what happened in a tiny little place called Iceland. You heard of Iceland? They locked up most of the bankers involved in deals like this and said, you go to prison for stealing from your own people. That's what happened. But in the countries, the large countries, none of this has taken place. And while on the subject of crime and punishment, who has been punished for the war in Iraq? No one. I mean, at the very least, the United States should offer one person to be tried at the criminal court. And that could be Dick Cheney. He'd be a popular choice as war criminal. So laws that supposedly apply to others do not apply to the United States or its allies. And we're in a situation where it's become virtually impossible for mainstream parties and even some left groups and left parties. Only the Italian parties are saying withdrawal from NATO. We don't want to be part of a military alliance. The Labour Party in Britain isn't, not even Corbyn. Podemos isn't, saying we should quit NATO. So there are lots of problems, but this transition also offers solutions. And these solutions are in flux at the moment. There are left futures ahead. We see them, you know, in small ways in different parts of the world, though there have been defeats here and there. But I think that we are also on the eve of change in some shape or form, because the only other choice that exists is that of the extreme right, which is much, much stronger than us all over Western Europe and North America, particularly in this country. So we have to do something, we have to organize, we have to fight back, and on every possible level. Thank you.
I think that the Bernie Sanders campaign has really turned into the latest and perhaps most dramatic expression of what I would consider to be a deepening radicalization in American society. After all, this was supposed to be the year of Hillary Clinton's coronation as the leader of the Democratic Party and the presumptive nominee to become president, really. In many ways, the radicalization in response to both racial and economic inequality are not incidental to the Obama administration, but they are partly products of it. Millions of ordinary people who believed in hope, in change, only to see in the 8 years of this administration very little change in their day-to-day lives. Very little has changed, if anything, in the day-to-day lives of working class people. 55% of black workers in this country make under $15 an hour. 38% of black children live in poverty at the height of what Obama describes as an economic recovery. And 26% of black households experience hunger. Instead of a social safety net, the American working class gets prisons and policing as the public policies of last resort. The brutality and inequality at the heart of the American criminal justice system is most certainly suffered disproportionately by the black poor and working class. But this country also incarcerates white workers at rates not seen or even heard of anywhere else on the globe. This is the context, I think, within which we must understand the Sanders phenomenon. It is an electoral expression of a deepening anger at the multiple dimensions of inequality in the United States. And there are many positives to this, including the popularization of socialism, the broader discussion about inequality that almost never happens in this country. But I think that there is also a danger of narrowing the discussion only to what can happen within the electoral realm. Now is the time to raise questions of not only of how to build the social movements more broadly, how to make connections between the attacks on working class black communities, the attacks on our public schools and public hospitals and the public infrastructure, and really, how do we build a society not based on profit for the 1%, but a world where Black Lives Matter and a world where there is actual truth, where there is actual freedom. I think that these have to be the questions integrated into the discussion about what does the left do in this particular political moment of which there is so much promise and possibility that has been opened up. So I'll open with those comments.
We're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, the Sanders, Groundswell. I mean, I think these two phenomena, as Keeanga was referring to, are really part of a global process of revolt that has begun. As Bernie went all around the country declaring himself as a socialist and calling for a political revolution against the billionaire class, something a lot of people hadn't expected happened, which is that in the heartland of America, the seat of global capitalism, working people responded in great numbers. Tens of millions of people are angry at capitalism. They may not call it capitalism yet, many of them, but they are angry at the status quo. They're angry at the domination of corporation, at the brazen way in which the billionaire class and the banksters looted the economy and yet were the very ones to get rewarded, while working people were left with a string of foreclosure crisis, student debt, and many other, in just a myriad of problems that they're facing. We are seeing this amazing moment opening up. It is important that the left build united efforts to break away from the Democratic and Republican Party stranglehold and build our own independent strength and run independent working class candidates that are connected to mass movements and fuel our energy into mass movements, not channel it back into parties that represent the billionaire class. I wanted to quote Michelle Alexander, who has done an excellent job exposing, re-exposing the racial dynamics at work in America. And she recently wrote in The Nation that she, quote, holds little hope that a political revolution will occur within the Democratic Party without a sustained outside movement forcing true transformational change. I am inclined to believe that it would be easier to build a new party than to save the Democratic Party from itself. On Facebook, she put it another way. She said, quote, I do not endorse Bernie Sanders as a candidate because, and this is many weeks ago, I do not endorse Bernie Sanders as a candidate because I do not believe the Democratic Party can be saved from itself, and therefore I will not endorse any Democratic candidate, but I believe it is critically important that he is helping to build a popular consensus in favor of political revolution. I endorse the revolution, unquote. While Bernie has done, has shown that there is a huge opening for the left all across this country, we cannot hold our movement hostage if he decides to remain with the Democratic Party and endorse Clinton. We need to break away from that, refuse to whitewash that if that were to happen, and demand an independent course to be charted for our movement, Bernie or no Bernie.
The crisis of capitalism continues to deepen. Some of us think it begins in the mid-1970s with the 74-75 recession, then the next dip in 81, 82. We couldn't see how long it would take. And one of the things that some of us didn't anticipate is how the ruling class would make use of credit and debt in order to camouflage the depths of the crisis. And so many people thought they could use their houses as ATM machines. And all of that came to an end, though, in the bubble crisis in 2008. As Keeanga said, the crisis within one segment of the working class, within the African-American community, is especially grave. And the only figure I would add to her very helpful data that she presented is to look at household wealth, racial household wealth. And the latest figures from the Federal Reserve Board indicate that for every $1 of a white household wealth, African Americans have the equivalent of 6 cents. It may have gone up to 7 cents. But it speaks volumes. It speaks volumes about the reality of the African Americans. And Latinos are in a similar situation. Both groups, because of the housing crisis, were particularly affected. And if African Americans didn't achieve racial equality during the boom times of capitalism, does anyone expect that will be possible in this kind of economy where increasingly bourgeois economists are talking about the phenomenon of secular stagnation, where you have low growth rates, productivity rates at a historical low. An important moment in the history of the working class is what was achieved in the Freedom Now movement. I don't call it the Civil Rights Movement. The movement called itself the Freedom Now movement. It didn't call itself the Civil Rights Movement. Yeah. The civil rights that limits what the movement was about. Never forget what the slogan was of the famous March on Washington in 1963, for jobs and freedom. That's what the march was about. And so this slogan, civil rights, is a way of limiting what was the actual aspirations of the movement itself. But I think coming out of that second Reconstruction, as we sometimes call it, I think we find a working class that has less divisions in it than was the case going into the second Reconstruction. I'm old enough to remember, I grew up under the Jim Crow system. In 2014, I wrote that progressive forces should have no illusions that a Syriza government in Greece will advance the interests of the working class. I wrote that in 2014, and I'm sad to say, I think I was correct. And I made that assessment based upon an analysis of Marx and Engels and Lenin's approach to the electoral process. Marx, Engels, and Lenin argued that there is no parliamentary road to socialism. There's no parliamentary road to socialism. The Paris Commune had taught, the only time they ever made a revision to the Communist Manifesto, the Paris Commune had taught that the working class cannot seize the bourgeois state and use the bourgeois state to carry out tasks for the working class. The bourgeois state has to be replaced. The bourgeois state has to be replaced. And elections and parliamentary work are only a means to an end, not an end in itself. Only a means to an end. We use elections in the parliamentary system to get out revolutionary ideas, to talk to people, to build revolutionary movements. And the second task, Marx and Engels said and Lenin said, with the electoral process, we use that opportunity to count our forces. We use that opportunity to count our forces. And while Marx and Engels could not always be as explicit because of censorship and what they meant by it, Lenin could be very clear about it. We count our forces to determine the date, when to seize power. We use the electoral system to count who's on our side, who's willing to vote with their feet. That's the important, it's a means to an end. And we only have one example I know in history, where the working class has ever used the electoral parliamentary arena to seize political power, and that's what the Bolsheviks did in 1917. We should never confuse voting with the actual process of taking power. Power has to be taken. And this is what Marx, Engels, and Lenin understood, and I think that's the lesson for us.
So, as the publicity for this panel says, I used to work for Bernie Sanders as his press secretary. I think we can all agree, regardless of debating whether inside or outside the Democratic Party, that it's certainly been a remarkable campaign and that it's challenged every assumption. And it's challenged every assumption about what voters want to see in a presidential candidate. Will the Sanders presidential run make the difference? Will it be what finally crystallizes a broad progressive movement in the United States that outlasts the victory or defeat of a single candidate? Honestly, I don't think so. And not because of anything to do with Bernie, who's put his all into this national presidential campaign. Rather, I think that what's occurred in the 35 years since Sanders' mayoral victory in Burlington points the need to the creation of an entirely new politics, one that's based on organization, very much as you said, but not the kind focused on electing representative politicians to high office, most of whom have shown themselves to be largely unresponsive to the people who vote for them. Instead, it's time to take our cues from the horizontalist movements that have grown around the world over the past decades. These movements understand that if we're going to abolish racism, sexism, and other forms of social and economic oppression, we must address domination and hierarchy and reclaim politics to mean the activity of self-rule that we undertake when we meet face to face to make decisions about our communities. We must create organizations where ordinary people become transformed into political actors in everyday life. These horizontalist movements understand that representative electoral politics is a dead end, and that when we assign decision-making to politicians, no matter how well-intentioned they may be, we degrade the very concept of politics and the rich community life that should support it. So what does this mean in practice? Well, I'd like to give a little example, which is really to be found someplace far, far from us, and in many ways unexpected, but it's in the territory of Rojava, a swath of northern Syria with a total landmass that's really just about the size of Connecticut. There, the Kurds have established a bottom-up political system of popular assemblies. They've enshrined the values of non-hierarchy, women's liberation, ethnic plurality, religious tolerance, direct democracy, and ecological stewardship, to name just a few of the ideals. The inspiration for this new politics, according to Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan, comes from the work of my late father, Murray Bookchin, who elaborated these ideas in a series of essays and books, and whereas Öcalan calls it democratic confederalism, Murray called it libertarian municipalism or communalism. Bookchin's communalism represents a vision of assembly-based democracy that is inherently anti-hierarchical and thus the exact opposite of representative democracy. This politics is being articulated more and more in horizontalist movements around the world. We need enduring political institutions that are egalitarian, transparent, fully accountable, and directly democratic. They require time and education and the building of consciousness, but they are our only hope for creating fundamental political change. And I'll close with a couple of lines, just a brief anecdote. David Graeber, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was speaking with a member of the Kurdish autonomy movement a few months ago while visiting Rojava, and expressed concern about the toll that the Battle of Kobani against ISIS had taken on the Kurdish people, the deaths and displacement and really terrible destruction of virtually the entire city. The Kurdish man standing before him replied, "Don't feel sorry for us. We feel sorry for you. We have our freedom. You don't." If under the most punishing conditions of war, the people of Rojava can create neighborhood groups and councils to address local issues, if they can write a charter of common values and base their politics on that charter, surely we can begin that process in our cities and towns too. Thank you.
Whether it is an aunt in Afghanistan or an uncle in Iraq, or a kid from the South Bronx or from the South Valley. We were just speaking at RFK High School in Albuquerque, where the overwhelming majority of the kids in that high school are undocumented. When you hear someone speaking from their own experience, it challenges all the stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. I mean, you say, "It sounds like my bubba or my baby, my aunt, my uncle." I'm not saying you'll agree with them. How often do we even agree with our family members? But it makes it much less likely that you will want to destroy them. It's that understanding that's the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back. We need a media like WBAI in New York, like Democracy Now!, like community television in New York, and independent media all over this country and around the world to link together, to break through the static, that veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need is the media to give us the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Democracy Now!
Okay. Rage, rebellion, a new power. It looks like a kind of a dialectical triad of revolutionary process. First, there is a chaotic rage. People are dissatisfied. They show it in a more or less violent way, without any clear goal or organization. Then, when this rage gets organized, we get a rebellion with a more or less clear awareness of who the enemy is and what is to be changed. Finally, if rebellion succeeds, the new power confronts the immense task of organizing a new society. The never-ending story of the contemporary left is that of a leader or party elected with universal enthusiasm, promising a new world: Mandela, Lula, Tsipras, and so on. But then sooner or later, usually after a couple of years, they stumble upon the key dilemma. Does one dare to touch the capitalist mechanisms? Or does one decide to play the game? If one disturbs the mechanisms, one is very swiftly punished by market perturbations, economic chaos, and the rest. Just think about Venezuela today. This is why rage is not only at the beginning, but also at the end, the outcome of failed emancipatory projects. Just remember the French suburban riots of autumn 2005, with thousands of cars burning and a major outburst of public violence, around Paris mostly. What strikes the eye in these protests is, or was, the almost total absence of any positive utopian prospect. If May 68 was a revolt with a utopian vision, the 2005 revolts in France were outbursts without even a pretense of having a vision. It is all too easy to reproduce here the old opposition of presence and representation. Presence are authentic social movements, and then representation is the alienated, ossified party mechanisms, state apparatuses, and so on and so on. So the idea is that the left in power should at all costs keep alive its popular roots. I think that this mantra, when the left is in power, they should keep their link with popular social movements and so on, covers up the true problem. How to transform state mechanisms, how to make them function in a different way, instead of just supplementing them with popular pressure from below. In short, it seems clear that, apart from two great models, social democratic acceptance of parliamentary democracy and the Stalinist state, the left has no other practical mode to offer. All the talk about active popular participation, self-organization of the people or multitude in social movements, I think ultimately serves to obfuscate this lack. I'm ready to sell my mother into slavery in order to see a movie with the title V for Vendetta Part 2. What would have happened the day after the victory of the people? How would they reorganize their daily life? That's what we should remember today more than ever. These cheap insurrections where we have, we all cry with them. It's so wonderful. Oh my God, 1 million people on Tahrir Square, on Gaza Square. My heart is with them. We cry together. I'm more and more totally non-interested in this. What interests me is the morning after. What happens then? How will we change everyday life? How will people feel the change? If not, then if we don't confront openly this question, then we are ultimately just playing the game of those in power. But if the picture is so bleak, why then not call it a day and resign ourselves to modest reformism? Okay, liberal democratic capitalism is the only game in town. Let's try to make it a little bit better. The problem is, I think, that global capitalism confronts us with a series of tensions, antagonisms, whatever you call them, which cannot be controlled or even contained within the frame of capitalist democracy. The only true question today is, do we endorse the predominant acceptance of capitalism as a fact of nature, or does today's global capitalism contain strong enough antagonisms to prevent its indefinite reproduction? And my answer is, there are antagonisms. When they claim we who still insist on some utopian, for me not, vision of communism, my answer is a very simple one. Those who think that things can go on indefinitely the way they are now, maybe with a little bit of accommodation, but basically, as they tell a child when it's a scary night, don't look too much around, just look straight, go on. They are the true utopians, I claim. I mean, they are the utopians. Real utopia is in power today. The more capitalism gets global, the more new walls and apartheids are emerging, separating those who are in from those who are out. Not to mention new geopolitical tensions. This is, I think, a beautiful paradox today. Global capitalism, commodities circulate freely, but people, I hope you notice it, circulate less and less freely. Did you notice how, if you are old enough, I am, in the 60s, all that upheaval and so on, usually the radical protesters were using dirty words to shock the establishment. Now it's almost the opposite. The more you go to the right wing, the more they are vulgar. And I think we should proudly accept, shamelessly exploit this fact. No, today we, the left, whatever remains of it, are the only true defenders of simple common decency and so on. We are the moral majority in practice. Okay, but let me go on quickly to finish. What is happening today is something absolutely incredible. What Chomsky called manufacturing consent, the way our democracies effectively function, is falling apart. Because how our democracies function, one should be open and describe it in a critical way. For many people, they don't really want substantial democracy. They want the appearance of democracy, but with clear indication how you should vote. Consent is manufactured, and don't underestimate this attitude, which I found the most terrifying attitude, which is the attitude of, I had even a debate with Julian Assange with this, because he still thinks that by bringing out through WikiLeaks, whatever, he's teaching people something new. Basically, I don't think so. In a way, we all knew it. The problem is that We knew it but decided to ignore it. We wanted to act as if we don't know it. People accepted publicly they are against torture, but I claim even maybe the majority of the people would have said something like, okay, some things had to be done, but let's do it discreetly. I want to be able to pretend that I don't know about it, and so on and so on. And this is what WikiLeaks and things like this prevent you from doing. So and why is this so ironic? Because when this manufacturing consensus, the traditional way, for example, in the United States, the democratic process functioned but through these two big parties, mechanisms well established. When this is now falling more or less apart, it's so crazy because, you see, that's the perversion of our democracy. Precisely when people have an actual choice, and if, but we don't live in an ideal world, if. The only true election would have been, of course, we all know, Trump versus Bernie Sanders, no? That would have been a real choice. But did you notice, and that's the perversion of ideology, how from the hegemonic public opinion by the big media, the moment of real democracy, when people have a real choice, is called the crisis of democracy. Like it's no longer clear, and so on and so on. I am for democracy, absolutely, but democracy, now another provocation, I wonder how you will react if I tell you this. Democracy in itself doesn't mean a lot. Take Europe. If by democracy you mean people are enraged and they express their will against those in power by free vote, well, then you get a racist anti-immigrant in power. We shouldn't fetishize democracy. There are moments where when you have a certain ethico-political position, for example, immigrant rights and so on, you should even enforce it in a non-democratic way. I think that, no, simply the majority is not always right and so on and so on. We see this in Europe today. Here I have a disagreement with my good friend Varoufakis. He said in Europe, you know, this democratization of Europe. But I told him, is he aware he blames this centralized European anonymous bureaucracy for screwing the Greeks? We have to change democracy itself. To talk about, like today in Europe, my God, to talk just about transparency, people's will should be heard. Unfortunately, today in Europe, this means anti-immigrant populists are in power. So the problem is a very real one. I claim that we should avoid both traps. One trap would be this social democratic simple reformism, forget the big goals, just let's do it modestly, this, that. The other one, which is also false, is a kind of an abstract radical position. We need to wait for the revolution, we cannot do anything, we just have to wait for the big crisis, and so on and so on. Well, you wait, and then when there is a crisis, usually the new fascism will win. So let me just now really conclude with a simple metaphor from what I like, which are old science fiction movies. You know, this idea, you are in a room, many buttons, and you press the wrong button. A button, and you think nothing, just a light will go on, but then the whole room starts to fall apart or whatever. Really, I think we should find demands like this. Specific demands which may appear modest, but since our system is getting more and more ossified in a neoliberal way, if we insist on this demand, more will appear, and so on. So to conclude with the Hegelian paradox, Hegel always emphasized how the truth only emerges through illusion. I would have said this, yes, our goal should be radical transformation of society. But if you say this directly, it is meaningless. It means you just sit and wait. No, we should begin with modest demands, with choices which, if you are a radical revolutionary Marxist, may appear wrong illusory. But they will, if we insist on them, it will be more and more and more. In other words, we should not be afraid to endorse what I ironically call wrong choices, wrong in the sense of naive, moderate demands. But they should be well chosen. By beginning this, we get more and more and more. This is, I think, the only Marxist way. That's how I read Jacques Lacan, who wrote, interpretation is not tested by a truth that would decide by yes or no. Interpretation unleashes truth as such. It is only true inasmuch as it is truly followed. This is, I think, what Marx meant by his thesis 11. It's not, we should not interpret the world, but the true interpretation is not the one which is simply more in accordance with the object, but it is the one which unleashes change in its addresses. And that's why, being fully aware of his ideological limitations and so on, I still, from what I know, support Bernie Sanders. Because it's easy to play the game, oh, he's naive, social democrat, whatever. But he triggered a process. He triggered change, reached many people, and many things will happen there more and more. It's absolutely crucial to get things moving. And precisely in today's time, with the rise of the new right, racism, and so on, we should never forget that what Benjamin said, that behind every fascism there is a failed revolution. That is to say, this disintegration of today's, the mode of manufacturing consent, exploited wonderfully in a terrifying way, by the populist, racist right, also opens up a space for us. And it all depends on us, will we use this chance or not. Of course, times are dangerous. Times are extremely dangerous today. There may be a world war, whatever, but we shouldn't be afraid of it, because I remain a Maoist here. You know, with all problems with Mao, my favorite saying, which is now totally unmentionable in China, is, you know, there is great disorder under heaven, so the situation is excellent. There is great disorder today in American ideological machinery. It's our chance. Thanks very much.